Happy Easter, everyone. I'm so glad that you've decided to join us for another episode of Advancing Our Church. I'm your host, Jim Friend, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Laura Sicola. Laura is a renowned communications coach, educator, and author, and she has worked with individuals and organizations from all around the world, including Catholic organizations. And I believe as a Catholic expert in this field, Laura brings a unique expertise that will help all of us to improve our communication skills and achieve our goal to advance the mission of our church. Before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsor, Changing Our World. If you're looking to make a difference in your fundraising programming this year, then I believe Changing Our World can help you. Changing Our World offers an expert team that has been providing customized philanthropic consulting services for over 20 years to Catholic organizations all around the world. I invite you to contact them at changingourworld.com, or you can find a link to their website in the show notes of this episode. Once again, thanks to the Changing Our World team for sponsoring this episode. And now, let's get to work. Today we talk with Dr. Laura Sicola, a leadership, communications, and influence coach. She's a trainer, a speaker, the author of Speaking to Influence, Mastering Your Leadership Voice. She's the founder of Vocal Impact Productions in Philadelphia, and she spent over 20 years coaching, lecturing, researching, and publishing on topics such as executive presence, leadership communication, vocal empowerment for women in leadership, public speaking, communicating through conflict, and so much more. Her TED Talk, Want to Sound Like a Leader? Start by Saying Your Name Right. I love that title. It has over 5.5 million views. She's appeared on Fox Business News, Fast Company Magazine, Forbes.com, Conscious Millionaire Podcast, Coaching for Leaders Podcast, and now Advancing Our Church. Today we'll delve into Laura's expertise in communication and explore some of the key ways in which communication impacts the church and some of the wonderful ideas and concepts that she's developed throughout her career. Communications is such a broad topic that no matter how you advance our church, I know you're going to get something good out of today's episode. And so, without further ado, here is Dr. Laura Sicola. Well, Laura, welcome to the podcast. So glad to have you here on Advancing Our Church.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Laura, we go back, I guess, a ways. We first met each other on a capital campaign many, many years ago in Philadelphia, and it's been exciting to see you from a distance just evolve in your career, with your business, with your book. Congratulations. I know that you've done so much, not only in the business world primarily, but a lot in service to the church. So I'm excited about our conversation today.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to sharing and learning from you as well.
Well, Laura, to shamelessly steal your first question from your podcast, which is Speaking to Influence, tell us a fun fact about yourself.
A fun fact is that I speak 3 languages, 3.5. So Spanish, English, Japanese, and Pig Latin, if that counts. My mother likes to say I was the only kindergartner she knew who had mastered Pig Latin. So language and communication was always a really big focus for me.
That's excellent. Very impressive. My middle child, Madison, impressively speaks Pig Latin very well. In fact, she actually wrote her college essay about learning Pig Latin, and she got into Temple University because of it.
She wrote it about learning Pig Latin, not wrote it in Pig Latin.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm not sure she would have gotten in.
She might have. It would have stood out. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I think it was the creativity of it. But thank you so much for that. That's awesome. Well, let's start a little bit by helping our audience understand the work that you do. You're a TEDx speaker, you're an author, an entrepreneur, a business owner, an educator, a podcaster, and an executive coach. But I think maybe it's at the heart. I've heard you say when I read your book that you're a linguist, and the work that you do boils down in many ways to helping people to communicate their authentic self. So, under that light, tell us a little bit about some of your work, and please, to frame our conversation today, tell us a little bit about some of the Catholic work that you've done.
My pleasure. It is. I think you summarized it very well in that I am a linguist by training. I am a teacher at heart and by early trade, and my work has always been about trying to help people close the gap between what you think you say and what they think they hear. And that's where I really believe that the vast majority of conflict comes from, whether it's one-on-one or a larger scale is when two people are looking at each other and saying, but you don't understand. You're not listening to me. You don't understand what's important to me and why and all that. So as long as both people are still playing chicken and saying, no, you listen first, then we're going to keep just with that revolving door of frustration. So from a professional perspective, I work with leaders and aspiring leaders in whether it's for profit or nonprofit to help them go from being just not just the brains behind the operation, but also being the face and the voice in front of it, and making sure that when they need to talk to someone, whether it's to the board, to investors, to donors, to employees, to clients, whoever, that they can take the genius in their brain and the passion in their heart and make sure that when they open their mouth, both of them are visible and clear and compelling. And that's really the idea. How do you translate that so that whoever you're talking to in a moment, be it here on a podcast, on a stage, on Zoom, in a small conference room, but the other person hears it and gets it. And in reverse as well, that you are better able to hear and understand them, because that's where progress is made.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even in the most basic sense of those of us who are blessed with the vocation of marriage, listening to our spouse. And we were talking about that just a little bit ago before we started recording about the some of the pre-Cana work that you and your husband are doing. Listening is so important, whether
Yes.
you're a spouse or a fundraiser or what have you.
100%. And that is something my husband and I have been leading pre-Cana workshops on communications for a number of years now. And it's something that I also work with postulants in the church, in the archdiocese. For those who aren't familiar, the postulants are the pre-seminarians, that discernment year, trying to figure out what's the right path. Is it the right path? And if so, which one, moving forward into some more formal uh, vocation work. But in working with them, whether it's on homiletics, whether it's on lectoring, whether it's on conflict management, is actually a big piece of those kinds of workshops as well. And in some ways, it's not different from the work that we're doing in the pre-Cana space. It's trying to help people listen to what the other person is really saying, where it's coming from, understanding what's below it. Often people speak very emotionally when they're upset about something, not always accurately, not always diplomatically, not always fairly. So to figure out how to disengage from that emotional uh, layer that coats everything else, and figure out how to get to really what's at the root. What do they actually mean? What are they trying to say? What do they need to hear first? What do they need to say first?
Mhm.
Um, and then being able to better move the conversation from there. So it's people are people. That's the thing, and
Mhm.
trying to figure out what's at the core of their need to be heard and understood is going to be the door that gets you into having your needs be met as well.
And there's so well said, and there's so many tools out there now to listen, right? To gather people's input and to then be able to be proactive about that. And one of the things that I think about just when I was reading your book, which I highly recommend to our audience, especially if you're in the work of communications or development or geez, even as a husband, it's some of the skills are so basic and so helpful. But I thought when I read the phrase "what got you here won't necessarily get you there," and you were referencing in the book, some folks reach mid-career and they become an expert in their field, but they need that little extra bump to give them that executive presence, and
Yes.
that's where you come in to kind of help them bolster it. But it also thought about how that applies to the work of our church. What the primary tenets of our faith will get us, to salvation in the end, but maybe some of the ways in which we communicated that got us to this point in time need to change to help us to be better communicators in a world that is so ultra where communication is so ultra accessible
Mm.
and so different than it was back as when we grew up. So how do we portray that and portray the authentic teachings of the church and use the tools that we have today to help us get to the next level, right? To get us to get to where we want to be as a church.
That's a really big question.
It is a
We
very big question, so I don't expect you to have all the answers.
Sure, well, so the quote that you referenced, the "What got
Yeah,
you here won't get you there," that's, of
yeah.
course, the iconic, book, that I was referencing at the
Hmm.
moment by Marshall Goldsmith, which
Yeah,
I highly recommend to anybody who's in a leadership position or aspiring to one.
sure.
But oh gosh, when I'm coaching or training teams, it is always the idea that look, you're going to go up, you're going to um, continue on the career journey on that ladder up to a certain point based on your technical skills and
Mhm.
expertise, finance, fundraising, engineering, whatever it happens to be. But then there's this ceiling and your ability to break through that, what I like to call the linguistic glass ceiling, and transcend into a leadership role rather than an individual contributor role or even potentially a manager role is whether or not you can make that shift. And it's about how you engage people and can you get through to them in a way that makes them feel satisfied. And that's where I help people make that transition. So, as far as communicating the core values of the church,
Mhm.
which fundamentally have not changed in 2000
Right.
years,
Mhm.
but making them relevant to
Mm.
today's audience who are far less. If you look at what's the primary, trending content on Netflix and any of the other, big streaming services out there, kinda goes antithetical to an awful lot of the core values of what we are taught. So, the question then becomes, how do we make it relevant? And I think one of the tools that we, can learn straight from the Bible itself, from Christ himself, is storytelling. Christ taught in parables. He didn't lecture. As a matter of fact, he almost never told anybody directly what to do.
Right.
It was the story, and what story will this audience appreciate? He's not dumbing it down to them. He's not talking down to them or insulting. He's not talking over their heads and trying to show how smart he is by using lots of big words and
Mhm.
quoting various people. He's just speaking at their level and being human and being relatable. And that's something that we often forget to do in our daily lives. A lot of people get stuck in what I like to call the expert's curse, which is where you know too much. You know your statistics, you know your catechism, you know your this, you know your that, you know your budgets, your numbers. And so you forget what not everybody already knows. You forget what not everybody cares about or wants to know or thinks is relevant. And we forget that they don't necessarily need to know all of these things. What do they need to know for you to hear what you need to hear? What's going to be the shortest distance between those 2 points? And, often, for example, when managing up, many people may be familiar with that phrase. So when you have
Sure.
to present to your boss or pitch an idea to somebody who has a lot more clout than you do, the there's a little nerves, a little anxiety that kicks in. There is the need to prove how hard you've worked, how much work you've done, how much research, how much time you've invested. So we tend to instruct or inform by fire hose method, right? Open mouth, turn on fire hose, and drown the other person in data and spreadsheets and way too much stuff.
Right.
And you just can't drink from the fire hose as the recipient. So take the need to prove yourself and show how smart you are, show how hard you've worked with all those big vocabulary words and all the jargon and stuff aside. Distill it down. Einstein, very much not a Catholic. Einstein is one of his great quotes is if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough.
Ah, very good. I like that.
So, how do you distill it down to a story, a parable, an example, a case study, a personal connection for them or for you that will suddenly make them go, "Oh, not I understand. Got it. That's where we
Excellent.
wanna go."
You took kind of that was probably one of the bigger questions I've ever asked anybody on this
I'm glad that
podcast.
was much bigger than that because I
I
got that,
I
that's
just want to
intimidating.
say you facilitated that so well and gave such a beautiful answer. What I want to pick up on is just what you were saying about using big words and sometimes maybe using theological terms that the average person in the pew may or may not be fully grasp. And I'll give a great example. Just this past weekend, I was speaking with one of my brother diaconate candidates, and he asked me what the word catechumen means. Now,
Mm,
catechumen, we hear every year at Mass that we need to pray for the catechumens as they prepare to be baptized at the Easter liturgy, at the Saturday night liturgy. So I wanted to make sure I had it correct. I looked it up just to make sure I had it. It is folks who are preparing for the sacrament of baptism as adults. But this was a fourth year diaconate candidate.
Yeah,
Not to throw him under the bus, and he shall forever remain nameless.
sure.
But that's the educated one. So there are many more folks in the pews who do not know exactly what the term catechumen means, and that's
Mhm.
just one example. So I do think one of the things that our parish has done, St. Anne's and Emmaus, we've had conversations around the pastoral council table about making sure that whatever we put in letters or in the bulletin is very accessible language so that it's more welcoming and inviting. And you talk a little bit about that in your book as well.
Yes, yes, you have to speak the language of your audience, whether it's from Spanish, Japanese, or Pig Latin,
Yeah.
or just changing that vernacular, the level of vocabulary used. I mean, the church, God love it, is not great at that. We had a shift a couple of years ago, not very long ago, maybe 10 years ago or so, in updating the mass, the language of the mass itself.
Yep.
And it's trying to make my understanding was that they were trying to universalize it a little bit more so that regardless of the translation, it was still as consistent as possible. But they actually ended up making some of the language less accessible. The one word that everybody, any reporter from any organization, any resource, Catholic otherwise, they loved it. Went from one in being with the Father to consubstantial with the Father.
Right.
Goodness gracious,
Right.
really did.
Consubstantial. Right.
So, we're looking at what is the objective in making this change. Are we looking for continuity, for translation purposes, for whatever, or is it about accessibility to the audience? There are
Right.
often you can't serve 2 masters, and this is one where something got sacrificed along the way. So then it becomes our job as representatives of the faith in whatever capacity to make sure that when we're sharing something, we retranslate. So they did their job on the organizational global continuity level, but now that just adds one more layer of responsibility for the rest of us who are trying to do the actual execution of it and
Mhm.
carrying out that faith here. So yeah, there are challenges with language along those lines, but always remembering not to talk down to anybody else, but to think in terms of, is this transparent in meaning? Are they going to be able to look at this and go, "Oh yeah, I get it," versus, "Well, I mean, I think I understand."
Right.
Because if
Right.
that's the answer, then the answer is they don't.
Correct. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. You touched on also just being wonderful storytellers. And that when we took a couple of homiletics class in the formation program for the diaconate. And that is one of our calls as we prepare a homily to make it relatable to today. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the different channels that we use when we communicate. You had talked about that in the book, the credibility, vocal and visual or nonverbal. And what I just found so interesting is just how once they're a little bit out of alignment, the message can dramatically change, and you can wind up giving absolutely the wrong message to your audience.
Sure. So when we talk about channels, we're not talking about, network versus cable versus streaming services kind of a thing.
Right.
When I talk about channels as in personal communication, it's about the idea that credibility as a leader in whatever capacity, or even not as a leader, we're talking about, your partnership with your kids, with whoever else. When you speak, we communicate through three quote unquote channels all at the same time. And it's the verbal, the vocal, and the visual. In other words, your words, your voice, and your body language. And there's a lot of misconception about how much of communication is carried in one channel or another, and there's lots of um, miscited and misinterpreted quotes. You've probably heard many of them bantering about, like, well, 55% of all communication is nonverbal. No, we
Mhm.
don't have time to get into why that number is out there and what it
Sure.
actually means, but what is most important is that it is the alignment, the connection between those 3, that's what make people trust and believe you. And they may not agree with you, that's different, but at least to believe that you're truly sharing something that you believe is true and that's more likely to connect with them. So just by way of example, so the words are the actual transcript. Let's get that clear. If I were going to transcribe this conversation, we look at what YouTube transcripts, closed captions, whatever it is, that's the verbal. The vocal is the sound of those words as they're coming out of my mouth, and the visual is what I'm doing with my hands, my facial expression, your how I look set up here on the screen, etc. The but if they're out of alignment, then it gets confusing for the audience. So, but if I were to introduce myself to you and just say, actually, you know what? Let's back it up for a second. If I said to you two words, let's look at the verbal transcript alone, nice haircut. But I said to you, nice haircut. Or I said to you, nice haircut. There's definitely a difference
Two different
between those.
meanings. Yeah, you take it
Right.
differently.
So
Absolutely. Mhm.
when it's especially when the meaning is simpler, a whole lot more can get distorted by the delivery of it.
Yeah.
Or, if I did say to you, "Yeah, nice haircut." I mean, sure, I don't know if anybody's just listening as opposed to watching, but
Right. No eye
I'm just
contact.
looking
Yeah.
over in the corner, I'm not looking at you at all. It's like, "Do you know that I got my hair cut? Can you see that I have hair? Do you"
Mhm.
you know, what you're claiming nice, but I have no reason to believe you because I don't think you've even looked at what it is that you're commenting on. Similarly, you're making a statement of your faith. Oh, yeah. I mean, I've been Catholic. I like being Catholic. Church is good. I'm glad I'm part.
It's
Okay,
okay.
well, what you claim doesn't sound like what you mean because there's that disconnect when you're arguing with somebody. You have a difference of opinion, and you say, I understand where you're coming from in your perspective on that, whether regardless of what the topic is you're deliberating. There's a difference between saying, "Look, I understand where you're coming from. Yeah, I understand it," versus, I understand where you're coming from, and I do want to talk to you about it." One is utterly judgmental and a yeah, whatever, and one is a lot more empathetic. So it's that ability to really be, and that's where the argument about, well, it's not what you said, it's how you said it,
Mhm.
kind of that argument comes through. And it's not that the how you say it matters in general more than what you said. It's that in that moment, you don't seem to believe what you were saying. You were out
Mhm.
of alignment. Therefore, I do not believe what you just claimed. That's where that phrase comes in most. It's not about a universality of the how you say it. Because you can have, you can say things really lovely, but in a lovely way, but have it be bad content too, in which case, I could say to you, "You know what? Jim, I just think you're an idiot. It's great. I mean, we're friends. I just think you're an idiot." It's,
Right.
well, I'm saying it nicely. Does how I said matter? No, you just called me an idiot. So clearly
Right.
the what you say does matter. Just because you said it nicely doesn't make it better. So it does really, really have to be both. And that's where we tend to miss because we don't realize where we are out of alignment when we speak.
It reminds me of, I had a boss that used to say, "The right message delivered the wrong way is still the wrong message."
Yes,
And he was always, very conscious of that because, he had to deliver a lot of tough messages sometimes as a person in leadership.
sure.
And sometimes our bishops, our pastors are also in that position where they
Oh,
have
sure.
to deliver a difficult message, whether it be a parish consolidation, a closing of a school, an incident happens we've had lots of incidents in the Catholic Church without going into detail over the last 20 years,
Or
but
longer.
longer, yeah. But but how do you deliver a difficult message? What is the best way to, because sometimes in crisis communications or when things are really tough, we find sometimes that we're maybe not connecting with our audiences, or uh, maybe that situation is thrust upon a pastor who doesn't feel quite equipped to deliver bad news to his parish. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, it's so situationally dependent.
Sure, good point.
There's a big difference between, eh, you know, scandal versus, we didn't meet budget, and so we're gonna have to put off, eh, you know, having a CYO basketball team this year.
Right.
So what's your definition of bad news?
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, are you laying somebody off? Are
Yeah.
you, was something stolen? What's the nature of is there a massive conflict? Um, I think when in doubt, a general rule of thumb is lead with empathy. Um, and there is you can be humble and confident at the same time. And that's important. So even if you have to acknowledge that you made a mistake, you want to apologize for something, you want to, a leader needs to be able to acknowledge when they were wrong,
Mhm.
when they failed in some capacity or other. But there's a difference in want if you're still looking for your congregation or your followers or your team or whoever the audience is to still trust you as a leader moving forward, because you still are, and if you still want them to stay, then that's important. Everybody makes mistakes. So if your ability to run a team is based on them thinking that you're perfect, you're doomed.
Right.
That's not going to work. So to be able to own up to something, or to be able to share news transparently and say, look, there's nothing that I there's no conversation I want to have less right now. Um, but we need to talk about stuff. I'm going to own this. I need your help, or I want to apologize for you. This was a mistake that I made. And here's what I didn't see. Here's what someone told me and I didn't listen to. And regardless of my reasons or not, I own this. This was on me. And I I'll make it right, or I need your help to make it right, whatever it is. But as long as it's not and this is where, the nuances of the delivery and the words make a difference. Because if you're going to come with your tail tucked between your legs and sort of really kind of mumbly say, yeah, so um, I, okay, so that didn't quite go according to plan. And I know you told me not to, and I did it anyway. And, coming as like the contrite 13-year-old who's just waiting to get punished doesn't say leader moving forward, but someone who says, I made this call and it was the wrong call in retrospect, and I own this. And, it's not, well, I made the call. Look, I own it. And okay, so look, I made the mistake, and just, where you're really not owning it, you're saying it, but you're still super defensive.
Mhm.
Like, we're not on the same team yet. We're not on the same page. So there's so many details. Think about it this way. When you think about how do you deliver, all the different aspects of your voice and of the words that you use and your speed and your volume and the all that stuff. Think about them as being different levers on a DJ's mixing board.
Hmm.
So, what's the perfect sound for this particular song? Maybe a little bit more treble, maybe a little bit more bass, maybe a little bit less reverb, maybe a little bit more something, maybe a lot more this or that. If it's going to have a lot of brass versus a lot of drums versus a lot of something or other. So, there is no single answer of what's the formula, but it is going to be a lot of watch the video afterwards. If you can even try, best tool I can give you, role play whatever it is you want to say to somebody and watch yourself on video. And then when you watch it play back for yourself, go, would I buy into what that person is saying? Or would I just go, oh my God, I can't believe you think how does that person sound? Because you'll be amazed at what the video reveals. And you're like, I thought I was coming across as sincere and apologetic, and I came across as totally stiff and disengaged. Or
Hmm.
I said 47 times in the first 48 seconds. That's not helping me or them or anybody at all. So get the video cameras like your best friend who has no filter whatsoever.
Yes.
Just tell you what you got to work on really fast if you want to be
Pretty
more effective and be heard.
It's black and white. Yeah, yeah, understood. Well, it reminded me of a situation that, we experienced years ago, in our parish. Actually, we had, a situation where our pastor was found with, uh, pornography on his,
Oh,
child pornography on his laptop.
awful.
I was the board chair of the school at the time as one of the parents, and so I had a good relationship with the principal, who called me that morning to tell me what had happened.
Yikes.
And there was a question. We had a parent teacher meeting scheduled that evening. I was supposed to attend, say a couple words as the board chair, and of course, the principal would conduct the meeting. It was put on the table at one point during the day. Do you even have the meeting? Is this just too difficult of a moment because we're in the heat of it? And we decided to go ahead and have the meeting because we felt that communication, even if we didn't have a whole lot of information to share at that time, just being present to the parents was the right thing to do. And so I'll never forget that night. I
Mm.
got up, I said a couple of words in support of our principal, in support of the school, who had nothing, no part in any of this, obviously. Our principal got up and said a few words. Obviously, the superintendents and representation from the diocese was there. But something happened that none of us expected. There was just a long line of parents who wanted to come up and thank Diana, the principal, for her leadership. And even many of them hugged her to console her as the leader of the school who was put in this impossible situation. And it was just a great example of sometimes just being in front of a situation like that and stay. And even if you don't have a lot to say, the fact that we didn't cower away and not be present to the people who had so many questions. And there were some clearly irate parents at the time, and they had
Sure.
things to say. And we didn't have a whole lot of answers because it was a situation far beyond any of our control, especially the principal.
Yep.
But the fact that she had the courage to be present just spoke volumes of her leadership. And I think I'll never forget that night. It's
Of
incredible.
course. I mean, she embodied so many important qualities at that point, and you and the whole board and those who said, "No, let's bring it to the parents now," was transparency, number 1, which is we don't hide stuff here. We're gonna share it for you with you for better or for worse. There was empathy involved, I'm sure, as far as, you were all shocked at this,
Right.
dismayed by it. That it needs to end immediately. We're taking action that we're I mean, you did it seems like you did everything right, and that's what people want in their leadership. We don't wanna hear the kind of news that you had to share,
Right.
unfortunately, at that point, but if we did, okay, there are 2 options, ways to make it better and ways to make it worse.
Hmm.
So,
Exactly.
at least show me that at that first inflection point, you took the right fork.
Yes, yeah, and that I think that paid dividends in the years to come, and just especially as parents were thinking about, do I re-up, even though this is a tough situation, and it didn't go away for a long time because it was very
Sure.
public in the news, but
Yeah.
we didn't lose that many folks, many kids at all, and I think it was really because of in that situation we just continued to overly communicate as much as possible. So but I'm not sure that you can really overly communicate in a situation like that. We stayed ahead of it is probably a better way of putting it.
Yes.
Um, so some of the folks who are listening, different topic, are development directors. We talked a little bit
Mm,
about some of our audience before we started, and they may report to, or they may be an executive director of a nonprofit, or maybe they report to a board. You talked a little bit earlier in our conversation around managing up, and in your book you talk about that. Perhaps to a secular audience, but it certainly works to any audience. And you talk about. I liked your advice on using the meeting to show how you strategically think about issues, because sometimes reports to boards can just get so blah and monotonous, and here's what we did, and but to really show how you're thinking strategically, I thought is really helpful. I've tried to do that in my own work because it shows how you're trying to move the ball forward, right? And that's what people are looking for, leadership. Can you talk a little bit about that?
there's about 4 different angles in that I can think of. Is there a particular as just as far as managing up more, or storytelling,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
which, board?
Let me give you something even more specific than that. Apologies, this isn't a better question, but a lot of our folks struggle with motivating boards as well, and so
Okay,
maybe and I know that that's like a across the board, even outside the Catholic world.
sure.
Nonprofit directors are always trying to motivate and engage boards. How do you use those meetings to kind of leverage their attention and show them strategically how they can plug into your mission and your plan, so to speak.
A lot of I mean, number 1, the storytelling is always important because you're going to show a lot of data typically in board meetings, and one thing that's not often transparent from the numbers themselves is the story behind the data. What
Right.
don't the numbers show me? Where did some of these numbers come from? What is either historical or what is impending? What are some of the other influential variables? What's attacked that you believe will change these numbers moving forward and why? But being able to tell the story of the numbers is always an important piece. What's the backstory? And just not getting involved in going kind of cell by cell through spreadsheets, which can be
Yeah.
really, not engaging,
Right.
frankly,
Very
and
monotonous.
especially when the board meetings, like every other meeting on the planet nowadays, is being held virtually, it's way too easy for people to tune out and multitask. And I'm pretty sure the new 2023 Webster's Dictionary is defining multitasking as being paying attention to everything except you.
Oh, interesting.
So,
Okay.
now, of course, I'm being facetious about that. I don't think it's actually the definition, but nevertheless, it's very
Hmm.
easy to tune out if you're just
Okay.
droning on about numbers. So, when in doubt, storytelling,
Mhm.
giving the information behind the data, you putting those numbers together, spent days, weeks, months deciding what belongs on that slide. What do you know that you forget that they don't
Hmm.
about this? What does this tell you? How should they feel? Here's another piece. It's very important to editorialize as you report. So, uh, people don't admit this because they're not consciously aware of it, but when they're listening to you give these kinds of reports of sorts, they do want you unconsciously to tell them what to think and how to feel. So, for you to be able to share information, for example, things like, we're really optimistic about this next quarter because, or we were surprised by these kinds of things. Okay, that's letting, because you're indicating how you feel about something, you've primed their brain to have that as a filter. Oh, I'm going to be optimistic about something. Good. I like optimism. Let's tell me why to be optimistic. And they're hungry for it. So there's something called confirmation bias, which is when you're expecting something or you believe something to be true, you look for data that proves you correct. So
Mhm.
then they will be ready to receive information that is optimistic or that they will find interesting. So, we want to prime, for example, that's what I call editorializing, is letting people know on a subtle subjective level what they should think about it. So why we need to do these kinds of things, or and how to feel. Little words like optimistic, or the difference between something that's falling versus plummeting is huge, or a massive opportunity versus a potential
Mhm.
opportunity. Those qualifiers change my emotional state when I listen, and that then helps me follow you on the journey toward whatever response you want me to give you.
So much behind that. One of the things you mentioned in the book also is, I think it was called the 5 by 5 principle when it comes to PowerPoint slides.
Sure.
I've seen way too many novels written on PowerPoint slides. And then another, just a small piece, but one that was reminded of a sister of Mercy who I used to work with, who worked with folks with disabilities,
Mm,
and she always told me, always use a microphone, no matter what. And you mentioned that in the book, because you never know who's in the room who may have a hearing loss, and
yes.
and a lot of times, especially in our churches, we're dealing with the senior crowd in many
Mhm,
cases that will show up for a prayer service or Stations of the Cross.
mhm.
So important to mic yourself. And, again, these are just some mechanical pieces, but I think so important to underscore. One other thing, two other things before I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, but I loved your description of vocal fry. I have, I think we've all heard vocal fry, but I didn't know it was called vocal fry. So can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about that?
Sure, vocal fry is a really, it's due to lack of breath support, but often when you run out of air as you're talking, or otherwise if you're maybe emotionally a little hesitant, it kinda gives you that creaky, crackly, gravelly sound like I'm demonstrating now, and, there are those people who will just kind of, maybe because 'cause they're slouching in their chair or just because 'cause they're otherwise indifferent or a little nervous, they'll constantly perpetuate that affect. I mean, it could also be a sign of something more medically wrong,
Right.
vocal nodes or acid
Yeah,
reflux or allergies. There's lots of things that could cause it. But in
sure.
the end, and there are those who will simply start clear, but then kind of trail off at the end of their sentences later on for a number of reasons. But regardless of the active cause, what the listener hears is someone who is, well, you tell me. I mean, Jim, if I conducted this interview and I spoke like this the entire time, what would you infer?
Yeah, and not a lot of people would probably be listening, right? Because it would, for all of us, it'd be a little annoying to listen to. Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's the annoyance on the one hand, and
Yep.
how do I sound to you?
Not confident. Yeah.
Just hesitant,
Yep.
indifferent,
Mhm.
sleepy, like I've been smoking 2 packs a day since I was 8. There's all sorts of things,
All those
but
things.
none of them are positive,
Right.
right? None of them say confident, leader, approachable, relatable, trustworthy. So we really have to be careful not to project those qualities. Should people make that association? Not necessarily, but they do. So be
They do.
mindful. If you don't feel those negative things, make sure you speak with a clear voice so that people don't misinterpret you for having those qualities.
Absolutely. And my last question for you today, or just conversation topic, would be tonality.
Mhm.
When in the diaconate program, we're taught to make sure that we don't draw too much attention to ourselves. We're trying to draw attention to the word. So not to be dramatic, in other words, or overly dramatic when we read the gospel, for example, or we
Mhm.
read, the readings at church. And I find, because I'm a lecturer at church, I'm trying to be very careful that I feel like sometimes I'm walking a fine line on that. I want to show inflection,
Mhm.
and I want to try to bring the scriptures to life, but I also don't want to look like I'm trying to do a one man play, to
Sure.
bring the scripture life. Can you talk to us a little bit about that tonality?
Of course. The the word inspiration or the word inspire comes from the Latin inspirare, which literally translates to breathing spirit into something, breathing life into it. When you lecture, there this may be the only chance for many people in the congregation to hear that passage. It may be the first time they've ever been in church, or it may be the last. They may not own a Bible, or if they do, not plan on cracking it anytime soon. So, what are you going to do to make sure that those words actually stick and that you're not just wah 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 while they're thinking about the upcoming brunch or the football game later that afternoon? And the way that we deliver those words does breathe life into the text. And I think that is important. Finding that balance. Look, you'll never please everybody. Let's get that clear. Because for everybody, on the one hand, who thinks when you animate the words a bit, uh, is really interesting and engaging and lovely, somebody else might go, "Oh, he's being melodramatic." And at the same time, on the other side, if you're keep it simple and clear, because that's the way you're supposed to do it. Just read it straight. Don't interpret it for me. Somebody else is like, "Oh my God, that guy's so boring. It's just he doesn't even believe what he's reading. He's just reciting the words off the page, not even thinking about it." So let's get that aside from the fact that you'll never please everybody,
Right.
but um, I do think it's important to read well. I've done readings at people's weddings, for example,
Mhm.
and especially at wedding passages, often it's Book of Genesis. It's so many different places, whether it's the Adam and Eve story or something else, and they are stories. That's the point. So there should be something along the that should engage and captivate the audience in it. And I mean, they're reading from Corinthians, what is it, chapter 13, and they are or chapter 11, 13. I forget which is got it backwards now in my brain. But love is patient, love is kind, love
Right.
is not jealous, which is the most beautiful text in the most monotonous writing style for someone to read out loud. It's anything but loving and kind in its delivery. So when I've read it with a deliberate storytelling cadence and pacing and a little bit of variation here and there to draw people's attention to certain things, that I've had people come up to me, including a rabbi that I spoke to when I was reading at a mixed ceremony where he was Jewish and she was Catholic, and so we did a little bit of this and that. And even the rabbi came up and said, "That was really beautiful. That was a great story. I'd never heard," and I'm sure he's probably heard that passage before, but nevertheless, it connects with people. And I've had people say the Adam and Eve story, taking the rib from Adam to create Eve, and somebody said, "I never realized that was a story." That was the first time people I don't know
Really?
would come up to me
Wow.
afterwards and say, "I never realized that was a story."
Because of the
So
way you told it.
yes.
Yeah.
That being
Wow.
said, there was also someone at a former parish I used to attend. I appreciated her effort in wanting to tell the story, but honest to God, it was like listening to Captain Kirk. It was from the Starship Enterprise. She
Right.
was so over the top. It was utterly distracting. So, there were others who loved when she read. I was not one of them, but, I appreciated her effort, and I just tried really hard to focus on the words and ignore the rest. So, fi and even in working with the postulants that I train on lecturing, there are many who feel like, "Well, it's not up to me to interpret for people. I'm just supposed to deliver it, and I wanna be, um, reverent in
Right.
delivering." But
Mm.
often when you're reverent and just giving people the words to allow them to put whatever meaning they want into it,
It's
then we do
monotone.
recording
Mm.
and we have them go back and evaluate their own and they go, "Yeah, I was aiming for reverent, but I realized it was kinda dry." So the best of intentions don't always translate, so it is really important to find that balance regardless, to make sure it matches.
I must, I read all the time, and my wife and I have a prayer channel actually where I read every day. But I read something probably 5 or 10 times before I actually get up in front of the
Mm,
congregation because, like you said, some of these scriptures are worded so strangely. It's just not everyday speak.
no.
So it doesn't flow off. And so understanding where to pause, where not to pause, where to keep going. I just find that they're reading the thing 5 or 10 times and really out loud so that I can hit all of my marks is just so important. But
Yes.
great,
Yes,
great
mark it
point.
up. I do it too. If I
Yeah.
have to do a lecturing,
Hmm.
putting in where there's gonna be a pause, which word I'm gonna punch up. Am I gonna extend something deliberately? That's where do you wanna draw people's attention? Because 'Cause they're only half listening for the
Right.
most part. So, help them get the other half of the way there.
Hmm. Exactly. Laura, any closing thoughts? This was a great conversation, by the way.
I'm thrilled that you brought up using a microphone, and that goes for whether you are in person or virtual. If you're let me s I wonder if I can play with this here. I wanna demonstrate just the
Sure.
difference of being on a I'm using a good microphone that I use for my podcasts and for my trainings and stuff, but even if you are, let's see, that's audio here. If I went from speaking on this microphone and then suddenly I shifted to using this microphone, do you hear a difference?
Big time. Yeah.
Big difference, and this is how most people sound. Well, suddenly don't didn't you immediately think, "Oh, I don't wanna listen to that."
Right.
This sound makes people tune out. So if you need to speak to people virtually in any capacity on a regular basis, when in your microphone, you don't have to spend $1,000, you
No.
don't have to spend 100, but it especially if you're in fundraising, oh my gosh, yeah, you need to
Yes.
do don't be penny wise and pound foolish. You need a good microphone, and if you are, in if you're live, same, please don't say, "Oh, I don't need a mic, I have a big mouth, ha, ha, ha." No, the fact that you might, but that doesn't mean that the acoustics in the room aren't sabotaging you. It doesn't mean that people, as you mentioned, whether they're 20 years old or 80 years old, that they can hear you. There was a priest at a church I used to attend. He he was a decent homilist and whatnot, and he had his beautiful kind of James Earl Jones voice, but
Mm.
he actively believed that he wanted people to have to work to hear him, to pay attention more. So no matter what, the microphones and the speakers in the house were always at about this level. And I thought,
Oof.
I have perfectly good hearing, and I'm straining to hear you. And frankly, you're not that interesting. So I'm not sure that I want to have to work that hard to catch your words, especially when most of it is, frankly, just the liturgy, which I don't need to hear you because I've got it pretty memorized at this point.
Mhm.
So you're making me want to tune out, and I'm here voluntarily and regularly. Who's your audience? Don't make me work just to hear what you're saying. I actually think that's quite arrogant. Forgive me for
No,
passing
it
judgment,
is.
but I think it's massively arrogant. You
Sure.
need to give people the ability to hear you easily. So use the doggone mic and turn up the house system. If you're going to
Mhm.
make people work just to hear you, I guarantee they won't bother.
Yeah.
So there's
Great
my
point.
final plug on how to not lose congregation.
Laura Sicola from Vocal Impact Productions. The podcast is called Speaking to Influence. The book is called Speaking to Influence. And we'll make sure we leave links in the show notes of this episode. Laura, it was a real pleasure to have you on today's show. Thank you so much.
Jim, thank you so much for the opportunity. Always a pleasure.
God bless. I want to thank Laura for being on our show today and for helping us to understand the many ways in which we can improve our own communications and our work in the church. I'll leave links to Laura, her company, and her wonderful podcasts in the show notes of this episode. Once again, thank you, Laura, for being on our show. Well, that's our show this week. Special thanks to Podastery Studios for helping us to produce another great show. And if you'd like to help our show, please leave us a rating wherever you downloaded this podcast. And if this is your first time listening to Advancing Our Church, I hope you're going to stick around and subscribe. You can find us on all places where you download your favorite podcasts. You can find us on YouTube. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. And for more information about our show, please visit us at advancingourchurch.com. Once again, many thanks to our sponsor, Changing Our World. Again, you can find a link to their website in the show notes of this episode. Well, that's it for me, everybody. Happy Easter. Have a great week. Take care. We'll see you next time. God bless.